They buried the truth deep, under dust, money, and fear. But the land remembers everything, and so do the people who refuse to forget. When a drifter arrives with nothing but silence and scars, he doesn't bring trouble, he brings truth. And truth has a way of burning hotter than any fire on the prairie. Stay with me, because justice is about to ride in.
The grass was dead. It had been dead for a solid month. Nobody on the Calloway ranch wanted to say it out loud, but the ground didn't care about politeness. It just cracked, wide, ugly fissures splitting the earth like a map of something that used to be alive. Nora Calloway stood at the edge of the western pasture. She stood there long enough for the August sun to clear the horizon and start burning the back of her neck. Behind her, Cal Briggs waited. He was the foreman. 9 years on this land. He'd learned the hard way that silence was the best answer when the boss was staring down a dying field. The wind picked up. It didn't rustle the grass. It scraped against it, sounded like sandpaper. Nora didn't turn around. Move the herd northeast, Cal. Kettle Creek still has water. We can hold 600 head through the winter if we move them this week. Cal shifted his weight. He didn't think she was wrong. But habits died hard, and Edmund Calloway had only been in the ground for 14 months. Edmund always kept the herd west during a dry spell, Cal said. His voice was low. Careful. Nora finally turned. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She just looked tired of the ghost holding the reins. Edmund is gone, Cal, she said. Her voice was steady, carrying clearly over the dry wind. But even if he were standing right here, it wouldn't change a thing. This land and its people aren't machines to be bled dry just to prove a point. Cal swallowed, taking his hat off and gripping the brim. We don't own nature, Nora continued, holding his gaze. She needed him to hear this, really hear it. And a man doesn't have the right to be wrong just because he's a man. That kind of pride ruins land, and it ruins people. I won't let it ruin this place. From now on, we do what's right for the living, not for a dead man's ego. Do you understand me? Cal nodded, slowly at first, then with a sharp, definitive jerk of his chin. Yes, ma'am. He turned on his heel and walked off to saddle his horse. For the first time in 14 months, he was following her orders without that heavy, doubting pause in the middle. Nora took a breath. The air was dry. It tasted like dust. But her chest felt a fraction lighter. She turned her back on the dead pasture and took the shortcut toward her office, cutting right through the main barn. She always walked through the barn. The smell of sweet hay and warm horses was the only thing that hadn't changed since the funeral. She stepped out the double doors into the breaking daylight. There was a man sitting on the porch steps of the ranch office. He wasn't sitting like a man waiting for a handout. He sat quiet, contained. His back was straight but not stiff. His hands rested easy on his knees. A battered hat sat on the wood beside him. When Nora walked up, he stood. He didn't rush. He didn't try to puff out his chest and take up all the air in the yard. Nora looked at him the way she looked at her land. She didn't look for what she wanted to see. She looked for what was actually there. His boots were worn from the inside out. A man who walked more than he rode. His hands were thick with real working calluses. He looked like a man who was entirely used to not knowing if he was welcome. What do you need? Nora asked. She didn't ask, can I help you? 11 years of marriage had taught her that the first question you ask sets the rules for the whole conversation. My name is Jesse Vane, he said. His voice was calm, grounded. Come down from New Mexico. Heard there was work in the Panhandle. I can mend fence, work cattle, handle horses. Whatever you need. Nora just looked at him. She let the silence stretch. Most men couldn't handle that kind of quiet. They'd start talking. They'd try to sell themselves, fill the empty air with big promises and loud stories. Jesse didn't say a word. He just stood there and waited. No nervous twitch, no bragging. What can you do with horses? She asked. Jesse met her eyes. Gray-blue met steady brown. Bring me the hardest horse you've got, Jesse said. We'll see. Something shifted in Nora. It wasn't trust. It was too early for that. But it was respect. It was the exact way she had wanted to be spoken to for over a decade. No empty promises, just the work. "You start tomorrow morning," Nora said. $3 a week, meals included. You bunk with the hands in the longhouse. Jesse Vane nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." Nora stepped past him, walked into her office, and shut the door. The room was cool and dark. She stood there for a minute, looking at Edmund's massive oak desk. She hadn't sat in his chair since the day he died. Today she walked around the heavy wood. She pulled the chair out, and she sat down. Not to prove a point, just because her feet were tired, and she finally felt like she belonged in the room. The gray Appaloosa was named Graves. Edmund had named him that, not out of affection, out of pride. The horse had shattered a ranch hand's right arm 2 years ago. Most men would have shot the animal, or sold it. Edmund kept him. He liked having something dangerous on the property that only he claimed he could handle. Truth was, Edmund couldn't handle him either. Nora didn't plan on watching Jesse Vane work. She had a desk full of unpaid bills. She had a stack of legal papers from Victor Hames sitting in a box. She just happened to be standing by the window because the morning light was better there. The corral was right in her line of sight. Jesse walked up to the heavy wooden gate. He didn't carry a whip. He didn't carry a rope. He just opened the gate, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. The horse reacted instantly. Graves threw his head back. He backed up against the far rails. He stamped the dry earth. His ears pinned flat against his skull. It was the clear language of an animal that had been beaten too many times, expecting pain and ready to deal it out first. Jesse didn't move toward him. He walked to the center of the corral, and he sat down in the dirt. He didn't look at the horse. He looked at his boots. He rested his arms on his knees, and he just stayed there. 15 minutes went by. Graves stood frozen in the corner, muscles twitching, waiting for the trick. 30 minutes. The sun climbed higher. Sweat rolled down Jesse's neck. He didn't wipe it away. He barely blinked. 40 minutes. Graves exhaled, a long, shuddering snort. The horse took a step forward, then another. Jesse didn't look up. He let the animal decide. He let the horse cross the distance. Finally, Graves lowered his heavy gray head. He sniffed Jesse's shoulder. He nudged the man's arm. Jesse slowly reached up. He didn't grab. He just rested his palm on the horse's neck. Outside the corral, Cal Briggs and 2 other hands were standing by the fence. Nobody said a word. They breathed like they were afraid they'd break glass. Jesse stood up, slow, easy. He dusted off his pants, gave the horse one last pat, and walked out of the gate. Nora was already outside. She had left the office without realizing it. She stood by the water trough as Jesse walked over to wash the dust from his hands. "How did you do that?" she asked. Jesse shook the water from his hands. He looked at the horse, then at her. "I didn't do anything, Mrs. Calloway. I just gave him a choice." Nora frowned slightly. "Edmund always said that horse needed to be broken, that you had to show him who was boss before he'd let you put a saddle on him." Jesse wiped his hands on his thighs. He turned to face her fully. The air between them was quiet. "You can't strip a creature of its freedom and demand its loyalty, Mrs. Calloway," Jesse said. His voice was steady. It didn't hold judgment for her, but the conviction in his words was absolute. Cruelty doesn't breed obedience. It only breeds a fear that is just waiting to snap. Respect has to be given first. I respected his space, and because of that, he allowed me into it. Nora stood perfectly still. The words hit her chest like a physical weight. Cruelty doesn't breed obedience. It was the exact opposite of everything Edmund had ever told her, everything he had ever done to her. She swallowed hard. "It sounds simple." "It usually is," Jesse said. He tipped his hat and walked toward the barn. Nora watched him go. That afternoon, Jesse knocked on the open door of the office. Nora looked up from the map spread across the floor. It was a large map, hand-drawn. Hers. It had tiny notes in the margins, written in her sharp, neat script. "Come in," she said. Jesse stepped inside. He didn't hover at the door, but he didn't crowd her either. "Sorry to interrupt." I was working the northeast fence line this morning. I noticed a feeder spring. Kettle Creek. It looked low. It's a drought, Nora said. I know, but it's dropping faster than the main water table. If it's drying up that quick, it isn't the weather. Nora looked at him. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman who had just heard someone else say a truth she'd known for months. The Garner Ranch, she said, northwest of here. They expanded 18 months ago. They dug new irrigation channels. Did you report it? To who? Nora asked. Her tone was flat. In Hale County, reporting a water dispute meant going through the legal system. And the legal system ran through one man. Jesse understood immediately. Who owns the Garner Ranch? Victor Hames's brother-in-law. Jesse absorbed that. He looked down at the map. He traced the line of Kettle Creek with his finger, hovering just an inch above the paper. He didn't touch her work. You want me to ride up there? Jesse asked. See exactly where they diverted the water? You don't have to do that. It's not your fight. You pay me to work this ranch, Jesse said. The ranch's water is my work. He didn't wait for permission. He just stated a fact. He left at dawn the next day, taking old Deke with him. They rode north. The land was cracked and brutal. They found the diversion point before noon. It wasn't a natural rockfall. It was a man-made dam. Good, solid engineering. Somebody had spent real money to steal that water. Jesse dismounted. He walked along the dried-up creek bed, checking the depth. That was when he saw it. An old wooden boundary stake driven deep into the hard earth. It was weathered, splintered at the top, but carved into the side, cut deep with a hunting knife, were two words: Daniel Vane. Jesse stopped breathing. He stared at the wood. The letters were jagged, carved in a hurry. It wasn't a signature. It was a marker, a record that someone had been here, a warning. Jesse reached out. He traced the D with his thumb. His hand was completely steady, but a cold, quiet rage settled in his gut. He didn't call out to Deke. He didn't say a word. He pulled the stake from the ground, snapped the carved piece off, and put it in his coat pocket. The wood felt heavy. He rode back to the Calloway Ranch in total silence. Victor Hames came on a Tuesday. He always came on a Tuesday. Always in the morning, always unannounced. He rode up in a polished black buggy wearing a suit that didn't have a single wrinkle. In the middle of an August drought in Texas, Victor Hames looked like he had just stepped out of a bank vault in Boston. Nora sat rigid in the parlor. Victor sat across from her. He drank the coffee Ruth brought in. He smiled. He talked about the heat. He talked about cattle prices. Every word he spoke was polite. Every word was a threat. It is incredibly difficult for a woman to manage an operation of this size, Victor said. His voice was smooth, like oiled glass, especially under these unfortunate circumstances. I only want to ensure you are protected, Nora. Edmund would have wanted that. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap. She hid her knuckles. If Victor saw them turn white, he would know he was winning. I am managing fine, Victor. Of course you are. But legal matters are complicated. I have some paperwork I'll bring by next week. Just standard items. Nothing for you to worry your head over. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Jesse walked past the open parlor doors. He was headed to the back porch. He didn't stop. He didn't stare. But as he passed, he glanced into the room. Victor stopped talking, mid-sentence. The lawyer turned his head. His eyes locked onto Jesse. It took Victor exactly 2 seconds to size him up. The worn boots, the steady walk. The way Jesse didn't lower his eyes when the rich man looked at him. Jesse gave a short, hard nod. Then he kept walking. Victor slowly turned back to Nora. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. New hired help? Yes, Nora said. She didn't elaborate. Victor took a slow sip of his coffee. He looks observant. He does his job. Victor set his cup down. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. I will see you next week, Nora. Have a pleasant afternoon. That evening, the air finally cooled. Jesse finished his work in the barn and headed for the bunkhouse. Before he reached the door, Ruth stepped out onto the back porch of the main house. She held a damp towel in her hands. "Vane," she called out. Not loud, just clear. "Come eat in the kitchen." It wasn't a request. Jesse walked up the steps and into the house. The kitchen was hot, smelling of roasted meat and strong coffee. Ruth pointed to a small wooden table in the corner. A plate was already set, full. Jesse sat down. He took a bite. He didn't ask why he was there. Ruth stood by the stove. She was a woman who had seen 20 years of Calloway history. She didn't waste time on small talk. "You favor him around the eyes," Ruth said. Jesse stopped chewing. He put his fork down. "You knew Daniel." "I cooked for him every day for 8 months," Ruth said. She turned around to face him. Her face was lined, hard, and entirely fearless. "A man doesn't eat at my table for 8 months without me knowing exactly who he is." Jesse looked at her, straight on. "How did he die, Ruth?" Ruth didn't flinch. She grabbed a rag and wiped down the heavy wooden counter. "The sheriff said he fell off his horse," Ruth said. Her voice was dripping with venom. "Said he hit his head on a rock 13 miles out of town." "You don't believe that. Daniel could ride a wild Mustang bareback in a thunderstorm. He didn't fall off a tired trail horse." Ruth threw the rag into the sink. She leaned against the counter, her dark eyes locking onto Jesse's. "This land was built on a lie, Jesse," Ruth said. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly heavy. "It was built on the idea that money and dirt are worth more than a hired hand's life. But people aren't property." She walked over to the table and slammed her hand down on the wood. "No law of God or man gives the wealthy the right to strip the poor of their lives and their truths. Not Edmund, not Victor, not any of them. People stay silent around here because they think they're small. They think keeping their heads down will keep them alive. But that silence is a crime. It is a rot that kills you from the inside." Jesse stared at her hand on the table. Then he looked up at her face. "Did Mrs. Calloway know?" Jesse asked. Ruth stood up straight. "That's a question for her. But you'd better make sure you're asking the right woman. You ask the boss's wife, you'll get a lie. You ask Nora, you might get the truth." The bunkhouse was quiet. The other hands were asleep. Jesse sat on his cot in the dark. A single kerosene lantern burned low on the crate next to him. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small folded stack of paper. It was tied with a piece of twine. He untied it. Daniel's letters. Jesse unfolded the last one. The paper was soft from being read 100 times. Daniel had been the only one in the family who could read and write properly. Jesse ran his finger over the ink. He had read this letter looking for clues, looking for names, looking for a reason to hate the Calloways. Tonight, he read it differently. "The boss is a hard man, Jesse. He smiles when he lies. I found something out by the creek today, something bad about the water lines. I'm going to tell him it's the right thing to do." Jesse skipped down to the last paragraph. The ink was rushed here, smeared. "I was wrong. He didn't care. He fired me. But Jessie, his wife, found me in the hall, Mrs. Calloway. She didn't look at me like I was dirt. She grabbed my arm and she told me to run. She told me to leave tonight. She said it wasn't safe. She was terrified, Jessie, not of me. For me." Jesse lowered the letter. He stared at the flickering yellow flame of the lantern. She warned him. Nora Calloway had risked her own skin to warn a hired hand. She had tried to save Daniel, and Daniel, being too proud and too stubborn, hadn't listened. He had stayed 3 more days to settle a score in town, and it had killed him. Jesse carefully folded the letter. He tied the twine back around it. He had come to this ranch looking for a monster. He had come looking for the people who had murdered his brother. Instead, he found a woman living in a cage, a woman who had tried to leave the door open for a stranger, and who was now paying the price for the men who held the keys. Jesse leaned back against the rough wood of the bunkhouse wall. He closed his eyes. He wasn't going anywhere. The fire didn't start with a sound. It started with a smell. It was 3 in the morning. Nora woke in the dark. She lay still. The air coming through the open window was warm. It smelled like toasted sage and burning dirt. Edmund used to keep the windows nailed shut. He hated the dust. He hated the wind. He liked controlling the air in his own house. 3 days after they put him in the ground, Nora took a crowbar to the nails. She hadn't closed the window since. Tonight, that open window saved the ranch. Nora threw off the quilt. She walked to the glass. She looked out toward the southwest pasture. The horizon was glowing, a low, ugly orange line eating its way across the black prairie. The wind was blowing east, hard. It was pushing that orange line straight toward the main herd. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She pulled on her canvas trousers. She shoved her bare feet into her boots. She didn't bother with her hair. She ran down the stairs and out the front door. Cal Briggs was just stepping out of the bunkhouse. He was sniffing the air. He saw Nora running across the yard. "Fire in the southwest corner," Nora said. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. Her voice cut right through the dark. "It's moving fast." Cal swore. He looked at the wind. "We'll lose the herd." "No, we won't." Nora's mind was running pure cold math. "Take 3 men, ride hard, push the herd northeast across Kettle Creek, get them into the rocks." "What about the grass?" Cal asked. "Fire's going to take the whole southern half." "Not if we starve it," Nora said. "Get the shovels, get the wet blankets. We're lighting a backburn." Cal froze. A backburn was a gamble. You light your own fire ahead of the main blaze. You burn away the fuel. When the big fire hits the burned patch, it dies. But if the wind shifts, you just burn down your own ranch twice as fast. "Mrs. Calloway, that's dangerous. Doing nothing is a death sentence, Cal. Go." Jesse Vane was already on a horse. He had saddled the gray Appaloosa graves in the dark. He rode up beside them. He didn't ask what the plan was. He had been listening. "I'll take the point on the herd," Jesse said. Nora looked up at him. The horse was restless, but Jesse held him steady. "Take Deke," she said. "Don't let them scatter." Jesse nodded. He pulled the reins, and the horse spun into the dark. The next 4 hours were a blur of heat and smoke. It wasn't heroics. It was just brutal, lung-scorching work. Nora tied a wet bandana over her mouth. She stood on the edge of the southern break. She lit a torch of bundled dry grass. She touched it to the earth. She started the backburn. The flames caught fast, too fast. The heat hit her face like a physical blow. Her eyes watered, her lungs burned. She swung heavy wet canvas sacks against the edges of her own fire, keeping it contained, forcing it to march in a straight line. Beside her, Cal and the other hands did the same. They choked. They swore. They swung their arms until their shoulders went numb. Miles away, in the dark, Jesse and Deke rode the edges of the panicked cattle. Graves didn't buck. The horse trusted the man on his back more than he feared the glowing sky. By sunrise, the wind finally died. The main fire hit the scorched earth of Nora's backburn. It flared up, hungry and vicious. And then, finding nothing left to eat, it folded in on itself. It starved. It died. The sun came up over a ruined world. 3,000 acres of the southwest pasture were gone, just black, smoking earth, but the barns were standing. The main house was safe. The cattle were bedded down in the northeast rocks. Nora walked away from the men. She walked 100 yards out into the burned pasture. Her boots kicked up gray ash. She found a low outcropping of rock that had survived the heat. She sat down. She rested her elbows on her knees. She dropped her head. She was covered in soot. Her hands were blistered. She was tired in her bones. She heard footsteps crunching in the ash. Jesse walked up. He didn't ask for permission to sit. There are times when asking permission is just putting another burden on a tired person. He sat down on the rock beside her. He smelled like sweat and horsehair. They sat in silence. They watched the smoke rise in thin gray lines into the morning sky. "That fire didn't start itself," Nora said. Her throat was raw. "No," Jesse said. He didn't say it to agree with her. He said it because it was a fact. "Started dead center in the southwest corner, 2 miles from the nearest trail, in the dead of night. Lightning hasn't struck out here in 4 months. Victor Hames, Nora said. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Jesse rested his forearms on his knees. He looked out at the black dirt. They want you to panic, Jesse said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Nora turn her head. They want you to look at this burned grass and feel small, Jesse continued, meeting her eyes. They want you to panic so you'll run and hide behind another man. They think because you are a woman, fear will make you hand over the reins. Nora stared at him, her chest tightened. But you didn't run, Jesse said. Tonight you saved this entire legacy. Nobody handed you the right to lead, Nora. You earned it with your own competence. Out there in the dark, you made the hard call. Don't ever let anyone tell you a woman isn't strong enough to protect what's hers. Leadership isn't born from what's between a man's legs. It's born from knowing the ground and having the grit to hold it. Nora didn't say anything. She couldn't. For 11 years, Edmund had told her she was fragile. He told her she didn't understand the world. He told her she needed him to survive. Now, a man with blistered hands and ash on his face was sitting beside her. And he was telling her she was strong enough to hold up the sky. She looked back out at the burned land. The smoke was clearing. The sun was fully up. Thank you, she whispered. Jesse just nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't make a grand gesture. He just sat beside her in the ash, a steady presence in a ruined field, waiting for her to be ready to stand. The house was quiet. It was mid-morning. The hands were asleep in the bunkhouse, recovering from the fire. Nora hadn't slept. She couldn't. Her mind was turning like a rusted wheel. She washed the soot from her face. She changed her clothes, then she walked out to the northern fence line. Jesse was there. He was hammering a loose rail back into a post. He wasn't sleeping either. Some men couldn't sleep when there was a threat on the horizon. Nora walked up behind him. I need you to come to the office. She didn't make it a question. Jesse set his hammer down. He turned, nodded, and followed her back to the main house. Nora walked into the office. She waited for him to step inside. Then she closed the door. She pushed it until the latch clicked. She didn't go to the desk. She walked to the window. She crossed her arms over her chest. It was the stance of a woman who needed an exit in her line of sight to feel safe. I didn't kill him, Nora said. She didn't start with a greeting. She started with the heaviest thing in the room. Jesse stood near the center of the office. He took his hat off. I know. Nora turned to look at him. How do you know? Because Daniel wrote about you, Jesse said, in the last letter he sent me. He didn't write about you like you were the enemy. Nora let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 years. She looked down at the floorboards. Daniel was smart, Nora said. Her voice was flat. She was reciting a nightmare she had memorized. He worked here 8 months. He figured out what Edmund was doing with the water rights. Edmund was taking money from the Garner Ranch, selling them Kettle Creek water that belonged to the folks downstream. Jesse didn't interrupt. He listened. Daniel confronted Edmund. He didn't threaten him. Daniel was just honest. He thought Edmund had made a mistake. Nora let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Edmund smiled. He thanked Daniel. And he fired him on the spot, told him to pack his bags and wait by the gate for his pay. Nora looked up. Her eyes were bright, rimmed with red. Edmund left the room to get the cash box, Nora said. I found Daniel in the hallway. I didn't have time to explain. I just grabbed his arm. I told him, don't stay in the county. Don't wait for morning. Leave tonight. Ride fast. He asked me why. I just told him to run. She uncrossed her arms. Her hands fell to her sides. They were shaking. He didn't listen, Nora whispered. He thought he had time. He stayed in town for 3 days. And then they found him dead on the road. I knew what Edmund was capable of. I knew how Victor Hames cleaned up his messes. I should have done more. I should have made him listen. It's my fault. The room was dead quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Jesse didn't step toward her. He didn't try to comfort her with a soft touch. He stayed exactly where he was. He looked at her with an intensity that anchored her to the floor. Your trauma comes from Edmund, Jesse said. His voice was hard, not angry but solid like iron. Your trauma comes from Edmund, making you believe every failure on this ranch was because you weren't good enough. That's manipulation, Nora. Nora flinched at the word. Men like Edmund use guilt like a leash, Jessie continued. They don't have the right to shackle a woman's mind with blame that doesn't belong to her. Listen to me. You did what a decent human being does. You stepped out of line. You risked your own safety. And you told the truth. But he died, Nora said, a tear finally breaking loose and tracing a hot line through the leftover soot on her cheek. Yes, he did, Jessie said. He didn't soften the blow. Because Daniel was a grown man who made his own choice. Daniel not listening was his own free will. We have to respect people's choices, Nora, even when they lead to tragedy. You cannot force a man to run. And you absolutely cannot carry the weight of Edmund's cruelty. Nora stared at him. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever taken the heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt off her shoulders and set it on the floor. You are not responsible for the evil other men do, Jessie said. You are only responsible for the truth you tell. You gave my brother a fighting chance, and for that, I owe you. Nora closed her eyes. The pressure in her chest, a pressure she had carried for 3 years, began to crack. It didn't vanish, but it shifted. It made room for her to breathe. When she opened her eyes, Jessie was still standing there, unmoved, steady. What does Victor Hames know? Jessie asked. The tone shifted. The healing was done. The work was beginning. Everything, Nora said. Her voice was stronger now. Victor was Edmund's shadow. Whenever Edmund crossed a line, Victor paved it over with legal paper. When Edmund died, Victor was the first one here. He spent 40 minutes alone in this office before he let the doctor in. Jessie looked over at the massive oak desk. He's got leverage on you. He thinks he does. We need to find out what it is, Jessie said. A man like Victor doesn't burn a pasture unless he's getting impatient. He wants you gone. Fast. Nora walked over to the desk. She ran her hand along the edge of the wood. He offered to buy the land, Nora said. Pennies on the dollar. He said it was for my own protection. He's running out of time, Jessie said. People who hold winning hands don't set fires. They wait you out. Nora looked at Jessie. Really looked at him. He was a drifter, a hired hand, a man who had every reason to take his pay and ride out before the shooting started. We are going to find proof, Jessie said. We are going to find whatever Victor is hiding. He said we. He didn't say, I will save you. He didn't say, leave it to me. He said we. Nora stood up straight. The ghost of Edmund Calloway suddenly felt very small in the room. All right, Nora said. We start tomorrow. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, so we can keep these stories alive together. The letter arrived on a Friday. It wasn't delivered by the regular post rider. A young man rode up to the main house just after breakfast. He wore a heavy wool suit that had no business being worn in the Texas Panhandle in August. Sweat stained his collar. He looked miserable. He handed a thick, wax-sealed envelope directly to Nora, tipped his hat, and rode off without asking for water. Nora stood on the porch. She looked at the seal. It was pressed with the emblem of Hale County. But the handwriting on the front was Victor Hames's, flowing, elegant, perfectly controlled. She took it into her office. She shut the door. She read the document 3 times. The legal language was dense. It was designed to confuse. It was designed to make a person feel small and stupid. But Nora had spent the last 14 months teaching herself how to read the fine print of her own ruin. It was a motion of transfer. Victor had filed a claim with the county. He was challenging her ownership of the 3,000 acres of the Southwest pasture, the same 3,000 acres that had just burned. The document claimed Edmund Calloway had signed an agreement to transfer that land to the Garner Ranch before his death. It claimed the paperwork had simply been delayed in processing. Nora had 30 days to respond. If she didn't, the land defaulted to Victor's brother-in-law. She set the paper down on the oak desk. The paper felt heavy. It felt like a stone. She walked to the door and told Ruth to fetch Cal Briggs and Jesse Vane. 10 minutes later, the two men stood in her office. Nora laid out the facts. She didn't dress them up. She didn't let her voice shake. Cal took his hat off. He rubbed the back of his neck. "We need a lawyer, Mrs. Calloway, a real one, from Amarillo. We can't fight a judge in Hale County. Victor owns them." "A lawyer from Amarillo costs money we don't have," Nora said. "And it takes time. Victor knows that." Jesse stood by the window. He hadn't said a word. He was looking at the map on the wall. He was studying the borders. "The agreement doesn't exist," Jesse said. Cal turned to him, frowning. "You don't know that. Edmund did a lot of things he didn't talk about." "Maybe," Jesse said. He turned away from the map. He looked at Nora. "But I know how men play cards. Victor Hames is putting a clock on you. 30 days. Not 60, not 90, 30. A man with real proof doesn't need to rush you. A man who is bluffing needs you to fold before you have time to look at your own hand." Nora held his gaze. "You think he forged it?" "I think he filed a motion, hoping you'd be too scared to check the records," Jesse said. "Where are the property deeds kept? Not here in Hale County." "Randall County," Nora said, "the regional office. It's an independent jurisdiction. Victor doesn't own the clerks there." "Then we ride to Randall," Jesse said. Cal shook his head. "That's a 3-hour ride each way, in this heat." "Saddle the horses, Cal," Nora said. Cal shut his mouth. He nodded once and left the room. Nora and Jesse rode out 30 minutes later. They didn't take a wagon. Wagons were slow. They rode side by side. Jesse on the gray Appaloosa, Graves. Nora on her bay mare. The Texas heat was a physical thing. It pressed down on their shoulders. It baked the moisture right out of their mouths. The trail was nothing but cracked yellow dirt and dead mesquite brush. Dust kicked up from the horses' hooves, coating their boots in a fine white powder. They rode for an hour in total silence. It wasn't a strained silence. It was the quiet of two people who understood that out here, you didn't waste breath on useless talk. You saved your water. You saved your energy. But as they crossed a dry riverbed, the rhythm of the ride settled into something easier. Nora looked over at him. Jesse sat deep in the saddle. He rode like he belonged there. Graves was calm beneath him. The horse's ears were flicking back and forth, listening to Jesse's slight shifts in weight. "Tell me about Daniel," Nora said. Her voice cut through the dry wind. Jesse didn't look surprised by the question. He adjusted his grip on the reins. "He was 7 years older than me," Jesse said. "We grew up in a dirt floor cabin in New Mexico. No school, no money. Daniel taught me how to read. He used to steal old newspapers from the general store, trace the letters in the dirt with a stick. He made sure I wasn't ignorant." Nora watched him. "He sounded like a good man." "He was a hard man," Jesse corrected gently. "But he was true. He didn't bend for people just because they had silver in their pockets. That was his problem, I guess. He thought the truth was enough to keep a man alive." "Do you think he was happy?" Nora asked. It was a strange question, but it was the one she needed an answer to. Jesse thought about it. The horse's hooves clicked against a stretch of flat rock. "I think he wasn't happy and he wasn't miserable," Jesse said. "I think he was just searching for something. He just didn't know exactly what it was." "Most people are," Nora said softly. She looked straight ahead. The horizon was shimmering with heat. They reached the Randall County Records office just after 1 o'clock. It was a brick building, stifling hot inside. It smelled like old paper, binding glue, and stale tobacco. A clerk with ink-stained fingers and a tired face sat behind a wire mesh counter. Nora asked for the land transfer records for the Calloway Ranch for the last 3 years. The clerk brought out a ledger the size of a saddle. He dropped it on a wooden reading table. Dust plumed into the air. Nora opened it. Jesse stood right beside her. He didn't crowd her, but he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his cotton shirt. They checked 1883. Nothing. They checked 1882. Nothing. They checked 1881. Nothing. "You were right," Nora murmured, running her finger down the final column. There's no transfer. Edmund never signed the land over to Garner. Victor fabricated the motion to scare me. Jesse didn't smile. He pointed to the bottom of the page. Look at the encumbrance column. 3 pages back. Nora flipped back. Her finger traced the heavy black ink. She stopped. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a land transfer. It was a lien. A mortgage. 3 years ago, in 1880, Edmund Calloway had mortgaged the entire 3,000-acre southwest pasture. He hadn't gone to a bank. He had gone to a private lender. The lender's name was printed clearly in the ledger. Victor J. Hames. The amount was staggering. And the ledger showed no record of a single payment ever being made. Nora stood frozen. The dusty air in the office suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Edmund had borrowed against their land. He had handed the keys to their livelihood over to Victor Hames, and he had kept it a secret for 3 years. Every day he had sat across from her at the dinner table. Every night he had slept in their bed, and he had known that the ground beneath them belonged to another man. Mrs. Calloway? The clerk was looking at her. Make a copy of this page, Nora said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Seal it. I'll pay double for the stamp. They rode back as the sun began to drop. The sky turned the color of a bruised peach, orange, purple, deep red. The shadows of the horses stretched out long and distorted across the prairie. Nora didn't say a word for the first 2 hours. She just stared at the space between her horse's ears. The shock had passed. What replaced it was a cold, pure anger. It burned cleaner than the fire from the night before. The silence stretched. Jesse didn't push. He rode beside her, a steady guard in the fading light. When the roof of the Calloway barn finally appeared over the ridge, Nora pulled her horse to a halt. Jesse stopped Graves. He turned in the saddle to look at her. Nora looked at him. Her eyes were fierce. There were no tears, only fire. He never told me, Nora said. Her voice trembled, but not with sadness, with rage. 11 years, Jesse. For 11 years I woke up before the sun. I balanced the books. I doctored sick calves. I thought I was building a life. I thought I was building a legacy. Jesse stayed quiet. He gave her the space to say it. He let me work my hands to the bone on land he had already sold away, Nora said. He looked me in the eye, and he lied by omission every single day. He wanted you blind, Jesse said quietly. Yes. Nora gripped the reins tight. Her knuckles turned white. And that is the greatest sin of all. A marriage without honesty isn't a bond, Jesse. It's a prison. Jesse nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. He stripped me of my right to the truth, Nora said, the words spilling out sharp and absolute. People are born equal. I am a human being before I am a wife. And nobody, not even a husband, has the right to turn their partner into a blind puppet just to satisfy their own greed for control. He thought keeping me in the dark kept me safe. It didn't. It just kept me chained. Jesse looked at her. In the dying light, she didn't look like a widow anymore. She looked like a queen who had just found her sword. So, Jesse said softly, we break the chain. Nora held his gaze. Yes, we break the chain. She kicked her horse forward. They rode down into the valley as the night took over the sky. The office was dark, except for the yellow circle of light from a single kerosene lantern. Nora had been in there for 3 hours. She had walked straight past the kitchen, past Ruth offering a plate of hot food, and shut the heavy oak door behind her. Jesse didn't follow her in. He knew better. A wound like that needed air before it could be touched. He took his plate to the bunkhouse porch. He sat on the wooden steps. He ate his beans and cornbread in the dark, watching the thin sliver of light bleeding from under Nora's door. 9 o'clock passed, then 10. The ranch was dead quiet. Even the horses had settled. Jesse set his empty plate aside. He stood up, dusted off his jeans, and walked across the yard. His boots made a hollow thud on the porch steps. He didn't knock. He just turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. Nora was sitting behind Edmund's massive desk. The surface was buried in paper, ledgers, receipts. Bank statements. She had pulled every file from the cabinets. She looked up when Jessie walked in. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. Dark strands fell across her tired face. "He mortgaged it all," Nora said. She didn't say hello. She just picked up right where her mind had been spinning. "Not just the southwest pasture. There are promissory notes here I can't even trace. He built a house of cards, Jessie, and he let me live inside it." Jessie pulled up a heavy wooden chair. He sat across from her. He rested his forearms on his knees. "I don't know what it means," Nora whispered. Her hands dropped to the desk. "Does it mean I didn't know the man I lived with for 11 years? Or does it mean I knew, and I just chose not to look?" "It doesn't matter," Jessie said. Nora blinked. "It matters to me." "Why?" Jessie asked gently. "So you can find another way to blame yourself for a dead man's sins? Because I'm not going to sit here and let you do that." Nora stared at him. The bluntness of his words stripped away her panic. "You don't need neat answers tonight," Jessie said. "Some things don't have them. The man lied to you. It's ugly, it hurts, but it is not a reflection of your worth." Nora let out a breath. She slumped back in the chair. "You don't try to make me feel better, do you?" "No," Jessie said. "I try to tell you the truth." He leaned back. He looked at the chaos of paper on the desk. "I'll tell you something else," Jessie said. "Daniel wrote to me about you, not about Mrs. Calloway, the boss's wife. He wrote about the woman who saw the problem with the water rights 6 months before anyone else did, the woman who tried to warn him that Edmund wasn't the man he pretended to be. Daniel didn't listen because he was a stubborn fool who thought a wife couldn't know more about a ranch than her husband." Nora stayed very still. "Daniel was wrong," Jessie said. His voice was absolute. "And it cost him his life. You saw things exactly as they were, Nora. You've always had the eyes for it. You just let Edmund convince you that you were blind. Stop letting him do it from the grave." Nora looked at the copy of the mortgage deed from Randall County. She reached out and touched it, not with fear, with finality. "Thank you," she said. Jessie just nodded. Victor Hames didn't wait a week. He came the very next afternoon. The black buggy rolled into the yard, kicking up dust. This time, Victor wasn't alone. He brought a passenger, a heavy-set man in a wrinkled suit, sweating profusely in the afternoon sun. Nora stood on the front porch. Jessie stood 10 feet away, leaning against a post, rolling a cigarette. He didn't light it. He just watched. Victor climbed down. He offered a hand to the heavy-set man, pulling him out of the buggy. "Good afternoon, Nora," Victor said. He smiled. It was the smile of a snake that had finally cornered a mouse. "Allow me to introduce Judge Morrison, from the Hale County Courthouse." The judge mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. He didn't look at Nora. He looked at his shoes. He looked like a man who had been bought and paid for and hated the taste of it. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Victor?" Nora asked. She didn't invite them inside. Victor sighed. He put on a face of deep paternal concern. He stepped up onto the first stair. "I come as a friend, Nora. I really do. The motion regarding the Garner transfer has complicated things. The courts are messy. I want to spare you that pain. I want to protect you from public scandal." "Scandal?" Nora asked. Her voice was ice. "Edmund left things in a precarious state," Victor said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. "I hold a note on the southwest pasture. A very large note. Overdue. If I call it in, the bank will seize everything. Not just the pasture, the house, the horses, the cattle." Victor took another step up. He lowered his voice, acting like a savior. "Sign the 3,000 acres over to me today," Victor said softly. "I will wipe the debt clean. You keep the rest of the ranch. You get to stay in your house. Everyone moves forward. I am doing this to protect you, Nora, because I care about Edmund's legacy." Jessie stopped rolling the cigarette. His eyes flicked to Nora. Nora didn't flinch. She didn't look at the paper. She looked Victor Hames dead in the eyes. "You aren't protecting me, Victor," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the yard like a rifle shot. Victor's smile faltered. Just a fraction. Nora, be reasonable. I am trying to shield you from the consequences of... Protection is shielding someone from danger while letting them stand on their own 2 feet, Nora interrupted. She took a step forward, forcing Victor to look up at her. What you do is entirely different. What you do is strip away the right to choose. You hide the truth in the dark. You forge documents. You hold secret debts over a widow's head and demand she be grateful for the crumbs you leave her. Judge Morrison coughed nervously and took a step back. That is not protection, Victor, Nora said. The words fell like hammer strikes. That is oppression. You think because I am a woman I will trade my autonomy for comfort. You think I will thank you for keeping me on a leash. Victor's face hardened. The fake smile vanished. The mask fell off. You are making a very foolish mistake, Victor said. His voice was a low hiss. If you refuse me, I will take it all. You will leave this property with nothing but the clothes on your back. Is that the freedom you want? I would rather lose this land entirely as a free human being, Nora said, her spine straight, her chin high, than keep a single acre of it as a slave to your dirty secrets. Silence rang in the yard. Victor stared at her. He realized in that moment that the frightened widow he had been playing games with was dead. He shoved the paper back into his pocket. He turned sharply. Judge, we are leaving. He climbed into the buggy. He didn't look back. He snapped the reins and the horses tore out of the yard, leaving a cloud of thick yellow dust hanging in the hot air. Nora stood on the porch. She watched the dust settle. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were perfectly still. Jesse pushed off the wooden post. He tossed the unlit cigarette into the dirt. He walked up the steps and stood beside her. He looked at the road, then he looked at her profile. He's going to file the foreclosure tomorrow, Jesse said quietly. I know, Nora said. He's going to use the judge to expedite it. I know. Jesse turned to face her fully. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply offered himself to the fight. What do you need me to do? Jesse asked. It was the question of a true partner, not a savior, an equal. Nora turned to him. The fire was still in her eyes, but now there was a sharp, calculating focus behind it. Tonight, after the hands go to sleep, Nora said, come to the office. We are going to tear Edmund's life apart, paper by paper, until we find what Victor is hiding. Jesse nodded. I'll be there. Nora walked back into the house. The door clicked shut. The war had officially started. The ranch was asleep. The crickets in the dry grass were the only sound out in the dark. Inside the main house, the office smelled like dust, old paper, dead cigars. Nora struck a match. She lit a second kerosene lantern. She set it on the edge of Edmund's heavy oak desk. The yellow light pushed the shadows back into the corners of the room. Jesse walked in. He shut the door behind him. He didn't lock it. There was no need. Nobody on the Calloway ranch was going to interrupt them. Where do we start? Jesse asked. Everywhere, Nora said. She opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet. She pulled out an armful of manila folders. She dumped them on the floor. She went back for the next drawer. For the first hour, they didn't speak. There was only the sound of paper turning, the scratch of a pencil as Jesse wrote down dates and numbers. Nora took the left side of the room. Jesse took the right. They went through feed bills, cattle auction receipts, supply ledgers. It was exhausting, boring work. Midnight came and went. Ruth opened the door at 12:30. She didn't knock. She carried a tray with a pot of black coffee and 2 thick ceramic mugs. She set the tray on the edge of the desk. She looked at the piles of paper covering the floor. She looked at Nora. She looked at Jesse. She didn't say a word. She just gave a single sharp nod and walked out. Jesse poured the coffee. He handed a mug to Nora. Their fingers brushed. The porcelain was hot. He kept 2 sets of books, Nora said, staring at a stack of bank statements. Her voice was flat, tired. I ran the daily ledger. I paid the hands. I bought the seed. I thought I knew exactly what this ranch was worth. But these statements, the numbers don't match. There are deposits here I never saw. Jesse sat on the floor. his back against the wall. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. Where did the money come from? I don't know. The names are blank. They went back to work. 1 in the morning, 2. Nora rubbed her eyes. Her shoulders ached. She was sitting on the rug, surrounded by 11 years of a dead man's lies. It felt like trying to dig a well with a spoon. Every time she found a number that didn't make sense, it led to a dead end. Jesse stood up. He stretched his back. He walked over to Edmund's desk. He didn't look at the papers on top. He looked at the wood. He ran his calloused hand along the side panel. He checked the drawers, top left, top right, middle. They all slid open easily. He knelt down. He looked at the bottom right drawer. This one is locked, Jesse said. Nora looked up. Edmund kept his personal stationery in there, and his humidor. I never had the key. Jesse gripped the brass handle. He didn't pull. He examined the gap between the drawer and the desk frame. Do you want to save the wood? Jesse asked. No, Nora said. Break it. Jesse went out to the hall. He came back a minute later with an iron fire poker. He wedged the flat end into the gap. He braced his boot against the desk. He leaned his weight back. The wood splintered. The brass lock snapped with a loud crack. Jesse pulled the drawer open. There was a humidor inside. There was heavy, cream-colored stationery. But underneath the paper, sitting flat against the bottom of the drawer, was a leather-bound book. It was a ledger. Jesse handed it to Nora. Nora set her coffee mug down. She wiped her hands on her trousers. She opened the book. The handwriting was Edmund's. Neat, perfect, meticulous. She turned the pages. The breath caught in her throat. This is it, Nora whispered. Jesse moved closer. He looked over her shoulder. It wasn't a ranching ledger. It was a ledger of payoffs. Nora traced her finger down the first column. Garner Ranch, water access, Kettle Creek. Monthly payment, $200. She turned the page. Garner Ranch, second diversion channel approved. Payment, $500. Next to every single Garner Ranch entry, there was a secondary note, a smaller amount subtracted from the total. Next to that subtracted amount, there were 2 initials, VH. Victor Hames, Jesse said. His voice was cold. He brokered the water deals. Edmund sold the water to Garner, and Victor took a cut to make sure the law looked the other way. That's why Victor holds the mortgage, Nora realized, the pieces finally snapping together. Edmund didn't borrow money from Victor. Victor used the mortgage as collateral, to keep Edmund quiet. If Edmund ever told the truth about the water, Victor would foreclose and take the whole ranch. They had him. They had the paper trail. It was extortion. It was fraud. Nora turned another page, and then she stopped. The ledger slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Jesse frowned. He reached down and picked it up. He looked at the page she had been staring at. It was an entry from October 1880. There was no dollar amount, just a name. Daniel Vane. Next to the name, in Edmund's perfect handwriting, were 4 words. Terminated October 14th, 1880. VH handled. The room went completely, devastatingly quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall suddenly sounded like hammer strikes. Jesse stood absolutely still. He stared at the 4 words. His eyes tracked over the letters. Again and again. Nora looked at him. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She was terrified, not of Jesse, but for him. She had just handed a man the written proof that his brother had been murdered, and the name of the man who arranged it. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to tear the room apart. She waited for him to grab his rifle from the bunkhouse and ride for Victor Hames's estate. Jesse slowly closed the book. He didn't yell. He didn't throw it. He set it gently on the desk. He leaned both hands on the edge of the wood. He dropped his head. His shoulders rose and fell with one long, shuddering breath. Jesse, Nora whispered. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the leather cover. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, but they were clear. There was a profound, terrible grief in them, but there was no madness. VH handled, Jesse repeated softly. They killed him like they were crossing an item off a grocery list. Nora stood up. She took a step toward him. We can go to the marshal in Amarillo. We have the proof. Jesse turned to look at her. They treated my brother's life like an asset to be liquidated, Jesse said. His voice was low, but it held a power that filled the dark room. It wasn't the power of violence. It was something deeper. They expect me to come after them with a gun, Jesse continued. That's how men like Victor Hames think the world works. Blood for blood. Animals in the dirt. He reached out and touched the cover of the ledger. But you know what, Nora? Jesse said, looking her dead in the eye. Their darkness doesn't make me want to become a killer for revenge. It just makes me realize something. Nora waited. The only way to defeat men who devalue human life, Jesse said, his words precise and unbending, is to live and treat each other with absolute respect, with humanity. Vengeance just proves them right. It proves that we are all just violent animals. I won't give them that satisfaction. My brother was a human being. He deserved the dignity of the law. He tapped his finger against the book. We are going to drag this into the light, Jesse said. We are going to use their own paper against them. We will fight them with the law, not with blood. We will take away the only thing Victor Hames truly cares about, his power. Nora stared at him. She had never known a man like this. Every man she had ever met in Texas would have drawn iron. Jesse Vane was choosing a harder path, a cleaner one. All right, Nora said. Her voice was steady. Then we don't go to Amarillo. We handle him here. How? We summon him, Nora said. He thinks I'm a terrified widow. He thinks I have 30 days to surrender. We don't give him 30 days, we give him tomorrow morning. Jesse looked at the broken drawer. He looked at the scattered papers on the floor. I have some writing to do, Jesse said. I need to write down everything Daniel told me before he died. Every detail about the water. Every detail about Edmund. I need to sign it. Swear to it. I have paper, Nora said. They didn't go to sleep. They sat at the desk. Jesse wrote his testimony. Nora drafted the summons. The kerosene lantern burned down to the wick. Outside, the sun finally broke over the eastern horizon. The sky turned a pale, bruised blue. The night was over. The reckoning was here. Nora didn't send a letter. She sent Cal Briggs. She told Cal to ride to Victor Hames's estate in town. She told him to deliver one message. Mrs. Calloway invites Mr. Hames to the ranch at 10 o'clock this morning to finalize matters. She didn't say please. She didn't explain. By 9 o'clock, the ranch was wide awake. The air was already hot. Dust blew across the yard. Nora walked into the office. She looked at Edmund's massive, leather-tufted chair sitting behind the desk. Help me move this, Nora said to Jesse. Jesse didn't ask questions. He grabbed one side. Nora grabbed the other. They hauled the heavy, overstuffed chair into the far corner of the room. Nora walked out to the dining room. She brought back a straight-backed wooden chair. Simple. Unforgiving. She set it behind the desk. She sat down. She laid her hands flat on the oak surface. She felt like herself. 10 o'clock arrived. The black buggy rolled into the yard. Victor Hames climbed down. He was wearing a dark gray suit. A gold watch chain hung across his vest. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He carried a leather briefcase. He didn't knock on the front door. He just opened it and walked in like a man entering a house he already owned. He walked into the office. Nora was sitting behind the desk. Jesse was standing in the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. Victor paused. Just for a fraction of a second, he noticed the new chair. He noticed that Nora wasn't crying. He noticed the hired hand in the corner. But Victor was arrogant. Arrogance makes men blind. Good morning, Nora, Victor said. He smiled. He walked over and sat in the guest chair. He placed his briefcase on his lap. I brought the paperwork. As I said, I want this to be seamless. I brought a deed of transfer. You sign the Southwest pasture to me, and I officially forgive the mortgage. It is the best possible outcome for you. Nora didn't speak. She just looked at him. Victor unlatched his briefcase. I know this is emotional. Giving up a piece of the ranch is hard, but it is for your own good. A woman alone cannot manage this burden. I am securing your future. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He set them on the desk. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it next to the paper. Sign at the bottom of the last page, Victor said gently. Nora looked at the pen. Then she looked at Victor. No, Nora said. Victor's smile froze. Nora, we have discussed this. If you don't sign, I will foreclose. I will have the judge seize everything. You can't foreclose on a fraudulent debt, Nora said. Victor stiffened. The air in the room suddenly grew very cold. Excuse me? Nora reached into her own drawer. She pulled out the copy of the mortgage deed from Randall County. She laid it on the desk. You hold a mortgage on the southwest pasture, Nora said. Her voice was perfectly calm. But Edmund didn't borrow money from you, did he, Victor? Victor stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. I don't know what you think you understand. Nora pulled out the second item. Edmund's private ledger. She dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. It landed right on top of Victor's transfer deed. Victor looked at the leather cover. All the color drained from his face. He recognized it immediately. I understand math, Nora said. I understand that Edmund sold Kettle Creek water to the Garner Ranch illegally. And I understand that you brokered the deal, took a cut of the money, and used this fake mortgage to keep Edmund on a leash. Victor opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in 14 months, the lawyer had absolutely nothing to say. Nora flipped the ledger open to the marked page. She spun it around so it faced Victor. I also understand what happens to people who try to tell the truth, Nora said softly. Victor looked down at the entry. Daniel Vane, terminated October 14th, 1880. V.H. handled. Victor's eyes flicked from the ledger to the man standing in the corner of the room. Jesse Vane unfolded his arms. He stepped away from the wall. He walked toward the desk. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out several sheets of folded paper. He set them on the desk next to the ledger. That is my sworn testimony, Jesse said. His voice was low, hard, and terrifyingly calm. Notarized by the bank clerk in town an hour ago. It details everything my brother found regarding your illegal water diversion. It details his confrontation with Edmund, and it details his murder. Victor stared at the papers. His hands began to shake. You have no proof I touched him, Victor choked out. It was a desperate, pathetic sound. We don't need proof that you pulled the trigger, Jesse said. We have proof that you arranged it. That ledger is a confession written by your partner. Victor looked at Nora. His chest heaved. He abandoned the calm lawyer persona. He leaned forward, his face contorting into an ugly sneer. You think a judge will care? Victor spat. I own the courts in this county. I own the sheriff. You bring this to trial, I will drag Edmund's name through the mud. I will ruin you. I will make sure you lose this ranch, and nobody in Texas will ever do business with you again. I did everything to protect this land. Nora didn't flinch. She sat perfectly straight in her wooden chair. You keep using that word, Nora said. Protection. You think because you are a man with a law degree, you get to decide what is best for me. I am the only thing standing between you and ruin, Victor yelled. No, Nora said, her voice cutting through his panic like a knife. You are the ruin. She stood up. You think power is holding secrets over people's heads, Nora said. She looked down at him. She had never felt taller in her life. You think power is forcing people to be quiet. You think power is a forged document and a bought judge. Victor stared up at her, breathing hard. But you are wrong, Nora said. Her words were sharp and deliberate. She wanted him to hear this. She needed him to understand exactly why he had lost. True power doesn't lie in how many people you can threaten into silence, Nora said. True power lies in being able to face the truth without needing to lie. You thought I was weak because I am a woman. You thought I would surrender because you made me afraid. She placed her hand on the ledger. You lose today, Victor, Nora said, not because you lacked cunning. You lose because you underestimated the resilience of people pushed to the edge. You underestimated what happens when human beings decide they will not be treated like property anymore. Victor looked from Nora to Jesse. He looked at the evidence on the desk. He was a smart man. He knew when a hand was completely busted. If this went to trial in a federal court outside of Hale County, which Jesse's testimony would ensure, Victor wouldn't just lose his license. He would hang. Victor slowly stood up. He reached for his silver pen. His hand was trembling so badly he dropped it twice before he managed to slide it into his pocket. "What do you want?" Victor asked. His voice was a hollow whisper. "I want the motion of transfer withdrawn by noon," Nora said. "I want a formal document stating the mortgage on the southwest pasture is cleared and fully satisfied. And I want you out of Hale County by the end of the week. If I ever see your face on my land again, this ledger goes to the U.S. Marshal in Amarillo." Victor swallowed hard. He looked at the ledger one last time. He picked up his briefcase. It was empty. He turned around and walked out of the office. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out the front door, climbed into his buggy, and drove away. The wheels kicked up a cloud of dust, but this time the dust didn't feel like a threat. It just felt like dirt blowing away in the wind. Nora stood behind the desk. She looked at the empty doorway. She listened to the sound of the buggy fading down the long dirt road. The silence that settled over the ranch wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. Nora let out a long, shaky breath. She grabbed the edge of the desk, leaning forward as the adrenaline finally began to drain out of her blood. Her knees felt weak. Jesse walked around the desk. He didn't crowd her. He stood next to her. He looked down at the ledger and the testimony. "He's gone," Jesse said. "He's gone," Nora repeated. She turned her head and looked at Jesse. The sun was streaming through the office window. It hit the dust motes dancing in the air. It lit up the worn floorboards. For the first time in 11 years, Nora Calloway took a breath in a house that belonged entirely to her. She looked at the drifter standing beside her, the man who hadn't tried to save her, but had simply chosen to stand shoulder to shoulder with her in the dark. "Thank you," Nora said. Jesse smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his mouth, but it reached his eyes. "Nobody told me to leave," Jesse said. The drought broke on a Tuesday. It didn't happen with thunder. There was no lightning to tear the sky apart. It just started as a heavy gray mist rolling in from the north. The air turned sharp. It smelled like wet sage and cold dirt. And then the rain began to fall. It was a slow, steady rain, the kind that sinks deep into the cracks of the earth instead of washing the topsoil away. 3 weeks had passed since Victor Hames drove his buggy out of the yard. 3 weeks of quiet. The ranch hadn't magically fixed itself. The southwest pasture was still a blackened scar. The bank accounts were still thin, but the rot was gone. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on the Calloway Ranch for 11 years had lifted. For 3 weeks, Nora and Jesse just worked. They strung wire, they rode the fence lines, they moved the herd out of the rocks and down to the creek. They ate breakfast with the hands at the long table. They didn't have late-night talks in the office. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer full of secrets. It was just the comfortable quiet of two people pulling their weight. But Jesse was a man used to moving. He had lived his whole life in the spaces between other people's stories. He had come to Texas to find out what happened to his brother. He found the truth. He helped secure the evidence. He mailed his sworn testimony to the federal marshal in Amarillo. His job was done. He didn't know how to stay in a place that didn't need fixing. He didn't know how to be a man who belonged to a piece of ground. So, on the morning the rain started, Jesse woke up before dawn. He walked out to the barn. The air was cold and damp. He lit a single lantern and hung it on a nail. He walked into Graves's stall. The big gray Appaloosa nickered softly. Jesse brushed the horse down. He grabbed his saddle from the rack. He hoisted it onto the horse's back and reached under the belly to pull the cinch strap. He was tying his bedroll behind the saddle when he heard the barn doors creak. Nora walked in. She wore an old canvas coat over her clothes. Her hair was pulled back loosely. Her boots were muddy from walking across the yard in the rain. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at the saddle. She looked at the bedroll. She didn't look surprised. She walked down the center aisle. She stopped a few feet away from the stall. The yellow light from the lantern cast long shadows across the hay-covered floor. "Everything is settled," Nora said. Her voice was quiet, steady over the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof. "The county clerk recorded the clean deed yesterday. Victor's firm is dissolved. The land is safe." Jesse kept his hand resting on the saddle horn. "I know." Nora stood tall. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't shrink into her coat. She looked at him in the breaking dawn. "Why are you still here, Jesse?" Jesse stopped. He didn't look down at his boots. He didn't put on the stoic mask of a drifting cowboy. He turned and walked out of the stall. He stopped 3 feet away from her. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. It was the truest expression she had ever seen on him. "Because nobody told me to leave," Jesse said. Nora's breath hitched. Just for a second. But she held her ground. She needed to say the words she had spent a lifetime learning how to say. "I am not your boss, Jesse," Nora said. Her words were deliberate and clear. "I am not ordering you to stay. For the first time in my life, I don't want to control anyone. And I don't want anyone to control me." Jesse's smile softened into something deeply reverent. "That is exactly why I'm not leaving," Jesse said. He took a half-step closer. The rain outside was picking up, drumming a steady washing rhythm against the wood of the barn. "My whole life," Jesse said, "people have either chased me off or they've hired me to use me. They looked at me and saw a tool, something to swing at a problem until the problem broke. But here, you gave me freedom. You let me choose." Nora listened. Her heart was beating hard against her ribs. "I want you to hear this, Nora," Jesse said, his voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute conviction. "True love, true partnership doesn't start with orders. It doesn't start with a deed of ownership or a marriage certificate signed out of duty. It starts when two completely free people look at each other, know all of their dark corners, and willingly choose to stay." He reached out. He didn't grab her. He just offered his hand, palm up, in the empty space between them. "A man who loves a woman doesn't protect her by putting her in a cage," Jesse said, making sure the words landed, making sure she knew he meant every single syllable. "He protects her by standing beside her while she fights her own battles. I don't want to lead you, and I don't want to follow you. I choose to stand beside you, as equals, nobody leading, nobody following." Nora looked at his hand, calloused, scarred, steady. She had spent 11 years married to a man who took everything from her. Her confidence, her voice, her right to the truth. Edmund had told her she was weak so she would lean on him. Jesse was telling her she was strong and asking if he could stand next to her. "You don't owe me anything," Nora said softly. "You paid your brother's debt. You cleared his name." "I know," Jesse said. "I'm not staying for Daniel. I'm staying for me, if you'll have me." Nora looked up into his gray-blue eyes. She saw a man who didn't want to conquer her land, or her spirit. She saw a man who just wanted a home. Nora reached out. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, solid, real. They didn't fall into a desperate embrace. There was no frantic, grasping kiss. They didn't need it. The connection between them was stronger than a sudden spark. It was forged iron. Jesse squeezed her hand once gently. Then he let go. He turned around, walked back into the stall, and unbuckled the cinch strap. He pulled the heavy saddle off Graves's back and set it on the wooden rail. He unclipped the bedroll. He took the halter off the horse and gave the animal a solid pat on the neck. He walked back out to the aisle. He stood next to Nora. He bumped his shoulder lightly against hers. They turned and walked to the open barn doors. They stood side by side, looking out at the yard. The sun was trying to break through the gray clouds in the east. The light hit the rain, turning the drops into streaks of silver. Beyond the main house, out toward the southwest, the burned pasture was drinking the water. It was black and ugly now. But underneath the ash, deep in the soil, the ground was alive. Seeds that had been dormant for 3 years of drought were finally getting what they needed. The hard shells were softening. Roots were pushing down. Green shoots were getting ready to push up through the dark. It would take time, a season, maybe 2, but the grass would grow back. This would die. The east fence line needs tightening, Jesse said, looking out at the horizon. The rain will make the post shift in the mud. I know, Nora said. I can take a crew out there after breakfast. Nora smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, but it felt like the sun. We'll both go, Nora said. They stood there in the doorway, breathing in the cold, clean air. 2 free people on a hard piece of land, watching the rain wash the past away, ready to build something real. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality. Out here on the open land, where the wind carries both dust and truth, stories like this don't end when the conflict is over. They settle into the ground, just like rain after a long drought. What we witnessed was not simply a battle for land or justice or even survival. It was a quiet, powerful transformation of what it means to be human in a world that often tries to strip that humanity away. Nora Calloway began this journey standing on cracked earth, surrounded by loss, control, and the lingering shadow of a man who believed power came from domination. She had been taught, like many before her, that strength meant obedience, that survival meant silence. But as the story unfolded, we saw something far greater than rebellion. We saw awakening. She didn't just fight others. She confronted the deepest lies she had been made to believe about herself. And in doing so, she reclaimed something no one has the right to take: her voice, her agency, her truth. Jesse Vane, on the other hand, walked into this story carrying grief heavy enough to break most men. He came looking for answers, perhaps even vengeance, but instead of choosing the easy road, the violent road, he chose something far more difficult and far more meaningful. He chose restraint. He chose dignity. He chose to believe that justice doesn't come from becoming what you hate, but from standing firmly against it without losing your humanity. In a land where guns often speak louder than words, Jesse proved that character speaks louder than both. Together, they showed us a truth that reaches far beyond the Wild West, that real strength is not about control, but about respect, not about forcing others into submission, but about allowing space for truth, for choice, for dignity. The way Jesse approached the wild horse mirrored the way he approached people. He didn't demand loyalty, he earned it. And in that simple act, the story reminds us that cruelty may create fear, but only respect can create trust. There is also a deeper lesson here about power. Throughout the story, we see men like Victor Hames who believe power lies in manipulation, secrecy, and fear. But that kind of power is fragile. It depends on silence, on ignorance, on others staying small. The moment truth is brought into the light, that power begins to crumble. Nora's final stand wasn't just about defeating a man. It was about redefining power itself. True power, as she showed, lies in clarity, courage, and the refusal to be owned by fear, by lies, or by anyone else. And perhaps the most meaningful thread woven through this story is the idea of freedom. Real freedom. Not the kind that comes from owning land or wealth, but the kind that comes from being able to stand as your true self, without chains. When Jesse chose to stay, not because he was needed, but because he wanted to, it marked something rare and beautiful. A relationship not built on obligation, control, or dependence, but on choice. 2 people standing side by side, equal, unbound, and fully aware of each other's scars. That is not just love, it is partnership in its purest form. So what does this story leave us with? It reminds us that no matter how harsh the world becomes, no matter how deeply injustice is rooted, there is always a choice a choice to act with integrity, a choice to speak the truth, a choice to treat others with dignity, even when it's difficult, and most importantly, a choice to refuse becoming the very thing we stand against. Because in the end, the land may crack, the fires may come, and the storms may test everything we have. But what truly defines us is not what we endure. It is how we choose to stand when everything is on the line.